This is actually really interesting. So there is this guy named Phil Salvador that made a legitimate, like 50-page scholarly article where he did an actual case study collecting actual data. And to summarize, this study had a shocking revelation that 87% of retro games are vanishing into oblivion. So in a groundbreaking analysis of classic games' commercial availability, only a mere 13% have been preserved to date. The ominous fate of these retro games has been unveiled in this recent study, which, like I said, revealed that an alarming 87% of them, or 9 of every 10 games basically, are slipping away into the abyss of time. I'm going to link the article in the description below. Alright, so let's get into this. So the Video Game History Foundation, or VGHF, this is a thing that I had never really heard of, but yeah, the Video Game History Foundation, in collaboration with the Software Preservation Network, conducted the first ever report on the disappearance of vintage video games. The study was literally just published this month. The study focuses on games that are released before 2010, which marks the onset of digital game distribution as stated by the Video Game History Foundation. So like I said, the study concluded that a staggering 87% of these classic games, so these games that were released before 2010, are no longer in circulation, rendering them critically endangered, or it was even quoted like they're going extinct, and therefore extremely difficult to access. Which means if you actually have a copy of them, it is kind of a very rare item that you actually have. So as an example, the report highlights the 2006 PlayStation 2 game Yakuza, which has since been remade into the well-received Yakuza Kiwami? Kiwami. I'm not exactly sure. It starts with a K. So the remake was called Yakuza Kiwami and it was released in 2016. However, the study emphasizes that Yakuza Kiwami, the remake in 2016, should be viewed as a separate title, considering the original game is no longer available. And this argument kind of forms the crux of the position of the article. And in the study, they kind of talked about the need to seek out and preserve vintage collectible games and hardware, or rather they talked about how it is extremely difficult to have access to these games because not a lot of people have the actual vintage hardware to access them. So not everybody has like a classic Nintendo or a classic Sega, and a lot of those consoles can cost like over $1,000 today. And they talk about how basically you either have to A, own one of these incredibly prehistoric consoles, B, travel extensively to access like specialized libraries that are in some countries that might have some of these old copies of these games, or C, you have to resort to piracy. And it talks about how none of these three options are desirable or feasible for most game enthusiasts. The situation appears grim, leaving the majority of video games inaccessible to all but most, or the most, devoted fans. And there is a disturbing lack of preservation. So the study's findings became even more disconcerting when it reveals that a meager 13% of game history is currently archived in these libraries. This predicament is compounded by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act's restrictions, which basically hinder the creation and distribution of copies for DRM protected digital works. While the U.S. Copyright Office has granted some exemptions for archiving digital materials, video games are inexplicably excluded, obstructing effective research and study of game history. And in the article, they kind of compare this to a world where the only way to watch, say, the huge movie Titanic is by acquiring a used VHS tape and maintaining outdated equipment. So in this case, even prestigious institutions like the Library of Congress would only possess a digitized version of the VHS tape, requiring individuals to visit the library physically to access it. Such a reality seems absolutely absurd, considering the monumental scale of the $180 billion gaming industry, where games and their historical significance are vanishing. And there are huge obstacles to preservation efforts. So the article acknowledges that the vanishing availability of most classic games is not entirely surprising. Nevertheless, the numbers still serve as a wake-up call, so the study's methodology involved random samplings of games spanning various consoles, PCs, and even some 1960s mainframe titles. I didn't even know, by the way, that they made games in the 1960s. The article emphasizes the importance of recognizing that game preservation extends beyond the popular titles like, say, a Mario game, as there are numerous lesser-known games with potential historical significance awaiting discovery by researchers. One example they used is this platform, or I guess a console, something like that. It's called Ant Stream Arcade. I'm actually gonna look this up, by the way. I want to see when this was released. Oh, okay, never mind. So this is actually like a website. It hosts like a vast collection of games from Commodore 64 to like the original Game Boy. Okay, so it's like an online library. Okay, so now that kind of makes more sense. So the article talks about if Ant Stream Arcade were to cease operations, these games could be lost forever. It also talks about the closure of the Nintendo eShop as another instance where availability drastically decreased, with the Game Boy library dropping at that point. Just like in one day when the eShop just vanished, the Game Boy library dropped from 11% to 4.5%. So it more than double, or excuse me, I'm wording that wrong. It cut to less than half of the original amount. And it clarifies that the criticism it is talking about, it isn't directed solely at Nintendo, but it highlights the risks of relying on a single point of failure for preserving a significant number of games. And it talks about the Entertainment Software Association as a roadblock to preservation efforts. So the Entertainment Software Association consistently opposes initiatives like copyright permissions and digital video game rentals, citing potential harm to the industry's bottom line. This association claims that the reissue market adequately addresses game preservation, but the article counters that this market only covers 13% of video games, with little hope of significant improvement in the future. And to kind of conclude this very interesting study, like I said, I've never really seen anything like this before. This is the first of its kind. It's very interesting that it's talking about video game preservation, almost like comparing it to like books or like ancient artifacts. I think that's kind of cool. Might sound kind of nerdy, okay, but video games are a work of art. Whether you think that statement is a little bit cringy or not, it is true. So to kind of conclude, the study's results will actually be presented during a 2024 copyright hearing to advocate for exemptions benefiting game preservation. The article expresses optimism regarding potential progress, suggesting that if the hearing goes well, digital library apps could become platforms for accessing games. Like I said, I linked the article in the description of this video. It is very interesting, and I went to college, so I read through a lot of these scholarly, peer-reviewed articles, and I never thought I would ever read one that is about video games, but I actually think that this article is not only very important, but just very interesting. It says a lot about classic games and how a lot of the not so popular ones, so not like the mainstream Mario ones, are actually going extinct. And like I said, if you have some of these lesser known games in your possession, you definitely have a very rare item that you should definitely hold on to, because you never know, you might have one of the only ones in the world.